popular stance is that each and every one of us has to have a will. It's a need, right? And we often talk about why this is important, right? Because as you know, it's that instruction, your last instruction as to what you want to happen to the things you're leaving behind and how you want your assets to be split amongst your family members, right? So it's a very important document because we know the implications of even not having it in place. But be that as it may, is it sufficient for you to have a 10-year-old will, 15-year-old will? Now, the reason why I'm asking this question and I want us to talk about it is because I have seen that a lot of people believe and seem to be adamant, that they have sufficient wills, whereas they drafted those wills more than 5 years ago, more than 10 years ago. I mean, throughout that time, a lot of things have happened. Their financial circumstances have changed. A lot of things have changed for them, right? So, is it sufficient for you to have such an old will? Is it necessary for you to revisit your will? Must you change it? Now, let's talk about why it is important for you to change your will. And let's talk also about the events that should prompt you to want to revisit your will. Now, without further ado, let's get to the discussion. In case you're new here, welcome. We hope you're going to stay with us as we have these discussions, which are going to be helpful to you. Right? So, without further ado, my name is Yolanda Mnyengeza, and I'm an attorney, the director at Mnyengeza Attorneys. So, let's get to the conversation. So, why should you change your will? I mean, is it even necessary for you to change your will? Well, a 10-year-old will, a 5-year-old will, I will definitely say yes, you have to revisit that will. And the simplest reason for this is that circumstances change. You change as a human being. The relations that you have changed. Your financial circumstances change. Your dynamics in the family changes as well. So you want to make sure that everything that you wrote 10 years ago still will reflect your current circumstances. Now, a lot of people who have died, long after they drafted their will, what has happened or what I have seen and experienced is that it often would not reflect what they intended now. And you'd find that beneficiaries start to fight about these things because of this. And this tends to cause a lot of tension in families. And also, there tends to be delays when it comes to administering this estate, because you'd find that this particular person, or you in fact, who drafted this will 10 years ago, did not make the necessary changes when the relationships you had changed. For example, some people had executors they appointed 10 years ago, but then no longer had good relations with those executors that they appointed in that previous will or that long drafted will, right? Or else that particular person now no longer has a good relationship with the beneficiaries of this deceased. So now when the deceased passes away, it's a debacle. The executor doesn't want to come to the party, but at the very same time, it complicates everything because they know they are nominated, which is something that you don't want because it causes unnecessary tension and delays when it comes to the administration of your estate. Now, the first event that should prompt you to want to change your will, number one, is a change in your financial circumstances. Listen, when your financial circumstances change, also the assets that you have will probably increase and you'll probably have investments, etc. So everything changes. Now, you want to make sure that this is also reflected in your will. In what sense? Remember, when you're speaking to your will and directing what should happen and how your things should be split, you're mostly going to focus on the things that you currently have, right? And most of the time, people will speak to what it is that is an asset right now and who it should probably go to and how it should be split. So if you have now bought something new, let's say you bought a property now, you probably didn't have that included in that will. So which means that you would also want it to be reflected there and also how you want it to be inherited. Remember, if you don't include any other property in your will and you don't state how additional properties are going to be inherited, those properties are going to be discharged as per the Interstate Succession Act, in a sense that for those particular assets, they're going to be treated as though you didn't have a will, and the law will then dictate how that particular asset should be distributed to your people that are inheriting, right? So it makes sense for you to rather revisit your will, Draft it in accordance so that it speaks to what you have currently. Otherwise, it's going to just cause a headache and a confusion for your family, and that's something that you do not want. Because I'm sure you have an idea as to how you want your things to be inherited. So you want this to be reflected in the will. So this should definitely prompt you to want to change your will. Again, events such as losing a child, such as having another child, such as getting divorced, these types of events should prompt you to want to revisit your will. Possibility is that when you're married, you probably would have your spouse as also part of the people that you'd like to inherit. But now, let's say that marriage has come to an end. You need to go back now and see whether or not you still want things to be inherited in that particular order, right? Because if that's not your intention, you want to get that fixed. Otherwise, things are going to be distributed this way. I've seen a lot of families disgruntled by this, where a spouse was previously married or a former spouse was married, and they didn't revisit their will. And the family was quite well aware that the intention of the spouse who passed away was not that, the former spouse that they were married to must inherit. But because they never changed their will, and it was well over 3 months, it was said that unfortunately the will have to stand because they were alive and healthy and could have taken action to try and change that will, but they did not. And so as a result, the former spouse ended up inheriting. So it's very important that when you have such status change events or such life-changing events, that you go back, you revisit your will so that it reflects your current affairs, right? Also, when you give birth to more children, you probably had your will structured differently when you had other kids. This one was not given birth to, but now you probably have different intentions. Go back, revisit the will. Or if you can't find where you actually drafted the will or you'd like to draft a new one, do that. But what's important is that it must reflect who and what you are and your circumstances currently. Now, the other event that should prompt you to want to revisit your will, right, is the change in your family dynamics, the changes in your family or your relations in general, right? Remember, probably 10 years ago, you had a good friend that you nominated as an executor, right? And this friend of yours probably adored those kids of yours. So you named them as the executor, right? Is that what you still want? Does your executor get along with your kids whom you've named as your beneficiaries? Because these two parties are going to have to work together now. Should you pass away, these kids or these beneficiaries of yours are going to be so reliant on this person who's called the executor. Is it still a good idea to have that particular person as the executor? I mean, how far apart do they live, from each other? How easy is it for them to have communications, because the executor will be assisting the beneficiaries in trying to administer everything for their benefit. So is it still a good idea to have that person that you nominated as the executor still stand? These are things that you want to assess because they are going to have an effect on your estate administration. They're going to determine whether or not your administration is going to take a very short, period of time, which means that it's going to be a bit seamless. Alternatively, they're going to determine whether or not this administration process is going to drag and be a headache on the people that you've left behind. This is very important for you to look at, and it's always important when you do see that there's a strained relationship between any of the parties that you've nominated, to think about how to rearrange things, because at the end of the day, the reason why you draft a will is you want things to be easy when you've passed away. You want the transition or this inheritance to easily go to your kids without any cumbersome issues or problematic, issues just transpiring. So you want to always look into this. And again, on the aspect of relationships, remember, you've nominated certain people to have certain responsibilities. You've nominated an executor. Probably it's a family member or a friend. And you nominated them 5, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, 6 years ago. You also have nominated let's say guardians if you have minor children, right? Are those people still in good health? As we always say, an executor has a big role to play when it comes to estate administration. They're going to have to visit a couple of departments, and they're going to need capacity and strength to attend to the estate administration. Unfortunately, they can't sit at home on their bed or on their couch and make calls for this thing to happen. They will have to go directly to certain departments, which often have a lot of queues. This person that you have chosen, are they going to be able to go to these different or even be able to get an agent, always be in constant communication with the agent, monitor what's going on in order to ensure that the estate administration, is proceeding in accordance, right? Think about this. The person that you nominated as a guardian, you probably still have children under the age of 18. Is that person still good? Are they still suitable? Right? In terms of health, do you think that they're going to be able to care for those kids should you still pass away and they are still minors? These are some of the things that you should think about and should actually prompt you to want to revisit your will. Which is why I say that you cannot have that will lying there for such a long time, because you could end up finding out, or your kids, could be the ones who end up finding out that everything written there is not necessarily in their best interest. Probably the person that you nominated 10 years ago was in good health, to take care of them should something happen to them at that time. But now that person's health has deteriorated, but they're still minors, they still need someone, right? This is going to cause a lot of issues for them. For instance, now they run the risk of having other people just come forward to say, we'll be the guardians, because this one cannot, be able to take up that role. So these are things that should make you or prompt you to want to revisit your will or draft another one, because you want to make sure that it reflects and it's going to be in the best interest of your family members. So from our overall discussion, the last thing that should prompt you to want to revisit your will, actually change your will, is the passage of time. Listen, over time, you change as a person. Your circumstances change, your relations change, your family dynamics change. For example, you probably had someone you were close to 10 years ago that you're no longer close to. You probably nominated them as a certain, person in that particular will. You want to revisit that will. Your financial circumstances have changed. The kids that you probably had 10 years ago as minors, they're probably now, adults. They have their own families. They live different lives. Does that will, reflect who and what you are and what you now intend for your family? This is why you should think about revisiting that will, because you have changed. Everything now has changed. You see things differently. Your kids have turned out differently. A lot of the things happening around you have changed. I mean, even the laws have changed. Is your will still a reflection of who and what you are and what you want when you've passed away? You can only answer that question once you have revisited that will, right? So just because you've drafted a will is not going to be sufficient for you. It's also important for you to always check once in a while, is it still a reflection of what I want when I pass away? If you do this, your will always speak to your current affairs, and it will always be to the benefit or to the best interest of your beneficiaries. So that brings us to the end of our discussion today, and I hope that this topic is going to be useful and it's going to prompt you to take action, more especially those that have wills that are 5 years old, 10 years old. It's time, right? We've grown up, a lot of things have changed. I'm sure if you were to have a proper thought about this whole thing, you would also agree that my life has changed. Be it for the worst or the best, but things have changed. So you do want to revisit that will to ensure that it still reflects your intention, because this is the last instruction you're leaving behind. So if it doesn't speak to you and what you had in mind, it's going to break the hearts of your family members, and also it might cause turmoil, right? When estate administration has to happen. So this brings us to the end of our discussion. Like I said before, my name is Yolanda Mnyengeza, and I'm an attorney. and a director at Miangazo Attorneys. Listen, we hope you join us next time so that you don't miss these conversations as we educate you about the most important things that you should know. We'll see you next time.